Hello everyone, welcome to the stream. Today we're going to be reading Man and His Symbols by Carl Gustav Jung. Just going to take a second to pull up chat on my phone. Now this is the last book that Carl Jung ever undertook for his death, the last work. And he usually made his works more obscure and complicated. This book was instead made to be understandable to the masses, and he hoped that it would reach a wider audience. So it's a glimpse into the depths of Jung's mind in a way that should be understandable to the layman. Just make sure everything is going properly. Seems like it. Still no chat on my phone yet. There we go. We're all good now. Hello, Long John Jimmy, welcome. Alright, let us get started. I'm gonna switch to the full camera screen for this. And got the book. And His Symbols by Carl Gustav Jung. This book, which was the last piece of work undertaken by Jung before his death in 1961, provides a unique opportunity to assess his contribution to the life and thought of our time, for it was also his first attempt to present his life work in psychology to a non-technical public. What emerges with great clarity from the book is that Jung has done immense service to both psychology as a science and to our general understanding of man and society by insisting that imaginative life must be taken seriously in its own right as the most distinctive characteristic of human beings. It's a very interesting take, I think. And something that's really resounded with me greatly. Hold on, John, if you're still in here, how you doing? All right, I'm gonna begin with there's a brief foreword. Man and His Symbols owes its existence to one of Jung's own dreams. The great psychologist dreamed that his work was understood by a wide public rather than just by psychiatrists, and therefore he agreed to write and edit this fascinating book. Here Jung examines the full world of the unconscious, whose language he believed to be the symbols constantly revealed in dreams. Convinced that dreams offer practical advice, sent from the unconscious to the conscious self, Jung felt that self-understanding would lead to a full and productive life. Thus, the reader will gain new insights into himself from this thoughtful volume, which also illustrates symbols throughout history. Completed just before his death by Jung and his associates, it is clearly addressed to the general reader. Oh, I'm glad you like this idea, Long John Jimmy. It's something I've been meaning to do for a long time. I'm really happy that I'm getting around to it now. Alright. This is the introduction now. The introduction is by John Freeman. The origins of this book are sufficiently unusual to be of interest, and they bear a direct relation to its contents and what it sets out to do. So let me tell you just how it came to be written. One day, in the spring of 1959, the British Broadcasting Corporation invited me to interview for British television Dr. Carl Gustav Jung. The interview was to be done in depth. I knew little enough at that time about Jung and his work, and I at once went to make his acquaintance at his beautiful lakeside home in Zurich. That was the beginning of a friendship that meant a great deal to me, and, I hope, gave some pleasure to Jung in the last years of his life. The television interview has no further place in this story, except that it was accounted successful, and that this book is by an odd combination of circumstances an end product of that success. One man who saw Jung on the screen was Wolfgang Voges, managing director of Aldous Books. Voges had been keenly interested in the development of modern psychology since his childhood, when he lived near the Freuds in Vienna. And as he watched Jung talking about his life and work and ideas, Voges suddenly reflected what a pity it was that, while the general outline of Freud's work was well known to educated readers all over the Western world, Jung had never managed to break through to the general public and was always considered too difficult for popular reading. Voges, in fact, is the creator of Man and His Symbols. Having sensed from the TV screen that a warm, personal relation existed between Jung and myself, he asked me whether I would join him in trying to persuade Jung to set out some of his more important and basic ideas in language and at a length that would be intelligible and interesting to non-specialist adult readers. I jumped at the idea and set off once more to Zurich, determined that I could convince Jung of the value and importance of such a work. Jung listened to me in his garden for 2 hours almost without interruption, and then said no. He said it in the nicest, most possible way, but with great firmness. He had never in the past tried to popularize his work, and he wasn't sure that he could successfully do so now. Anyway, he was old and rather tired, and not keen to take on such a long commitment about which he had so many doubts. Jung's friends will all agree with me that he was a man of most positive decision. He would weigh up a problem with care and without hurry. But when he did give his answer, it was usually final. I returned to London, greatly disappointed, but convinced that Jung's refusal was the end of the matter. So it might have been, but for two intervening factors that I had not foreseen. One was the pertinacity of Voges, who insisted on making one more approach to Jung before accepting defeat. The other was an event that, as I look back on it, still astonishes me. The television program was, as I have said, accounted successful. It brought Jung a great many letters from all sorts of people, many of them ordinary folk with no medical or psychological training, who had been captivated by the commanding presence, the humor, and the modest charm of this very great man who had glimpsed in his view of life and human personality something that could be helpful to them. And Jung was very pleased, not simply at getting letters, his mail was enormous at all times, but at getting them from people who would normally have no contact with him. It was at this moment that he dreamed a dream of the greatest importance to him, and as you read this book you will understand just how important that can be. He dreamed that instead of sitting in his study and talking to the great doctors and psychiatrists who used to call him from all over the world, he was standing in a public place and addressing a multitude of people who were listening to him with rapt attention and understanding what he said. When a week or two later, Voges renewed his request that Jung should undertake a new book designed not for the clinic or the philosopher's study, but for the people in the marketplace, Jung allowed himself to be persuaded. He laid down two conditions. First, that the book should not be a single-handed book, but the collective effort of himself and a group of his closest followers, through whom he had attempted to perpetuate his methods and his teachings. Secondly, that I should be entrusted with the task of coordinating the work and resolving any problems that might arise between the authors and the publishers. Lest it should seem that this introduction transgresses the bounds of reasonable modesty, let me say at once that I was gratified by this second condition, but within measure. For it very soon came to my knowledge that Jung's reason for selecting me was essentially that he regarded me as being of reasonable, but not exceptional, intelligence, and without the slightest serious knowledge of psychology. Thus, I was to Jung, the average reader of this book. What I could understand would be intelligible to all who would be interested. What I boggled at might possibly be too difficult or obscure for some. Not unduly flattered by this estimate of my role, I have nonetheless scrupulously insisted, sometimes I fear to the exasperation of the authors, on having every paragraph written and, if necessary, rewritten to a degree of clarity and directness that enables me to say with confidence that this book in its entirety is designed for and addressed to the general reader, and that the complex subjects it deals with are treated with a rare and encouraging simplicity. After much discussion, the comprehensive subject of the book was agreed to be man and its symbols, and Jung himself selected as his collaborators in the work Dr. Marie-Louise von Franz of Zurich, perhaps his closest professional confidant and friend, Dr. Joseph L. Henderson of San Francisco, one of the most prominent and trusted of Americans, Jungians, Miss Anelia Jaffe of Zurich, who, in addition to being an experienced analyst, was Jung's confidential private secretary and his biographer, and Dr. Yolande Jacobi, who, after Jung himself, is the most experienced author among Jung's Zurich circle. These 4 people were chosen partly because of their skill and experience in the particular subjects allocated to them, and partly because all of them were completely trusted by Jung to work unselfishly to his instructions as members of a team. Jung's personal responsibility was to plan the structure of the whole book, to supervise and direct the work of his collaborators, and himself to write the keynote chapter, Approaching the Unconscious. The last year of his life was devoted almost entirely to this book, and when he died in June 1961, his own section was complete. He finished it, in fact, only some 10 days before his final illness, and his colleagues' chapters had all been approved by him in draft. After his death, Dr. von Franz assumed overall responsibility for the completion of the book in accordance with Jung's express instructions. The subject matter of man and his symbols and its outline were therefore laid down and in detail by Jung. The chapter that bears his name is his work, and apart from some fairly extensive editing to improve its intelligibility to the general reader, nobody else's. It was written, incidentally, in English. The remaining chapters were written by the various authors to Jung's direction and under his supervision. The final editing of the complete work after Jung's death has been done by Dr. von Franz, with a patience, understanding, and good humor that leave the publishers and myself greatly in her debt. Finally, as to the contents of the book itself, Jung's thinking has colored the world of modern psychology more than many of those with casual knowledge realize. Such familiar terms, for instance, such as extrovert, introvert, and archetype, are all Jungian concepts, borrowed and sometimes misused by others. But his overwhelming contribution to psychological understanding is his concept of the unconscious, not like the subconscious of Freud, merely a sort of glory hole of repressed desires, but a world that is just as much a vital and real part of the life of an individual as the conscious, cognating world of the ego, and infinitely wider and richer. The language and the people of the unconscious are symbols, and the means of communications dreams. Thus, an examination of man and his symbols is in effect an examination of man's relation to his own unconscious. And since in Jung's view the unconscious is the great guide, friend, and advisor of the conscious, this book is related in the most direct terms to the study of human beings and their spiritual problems. We know the unconscious and communicate with it a two-way service, principally by dreams, and all through this book. Above all, in Jung's own chapter, you will find a quite remarkable emphasis placed on the importance of dreaming in the life of the individual. It would be an impertinence on my part to attempt to interpret Jung's work to readers, many of whom will surely be far better qualified to understand it than I am. My role, remember, was merely to serve as a sort of intelligibility filter, and by no means as an interpreter. Nevertheless, I venture to offer 2 general points that seem important to me as a layman, and that may possibly be helpful to other non-experts. The first is about dreams. To Jungians, The dream is not a kind of standardized cryptogram that can be decoded by a glossary of symbol meanings. It is an integral, important, and personal expression of the individual unconscious. It is just as real as any other phenomenon attaching to the individual. The dreamer's individual unconscious is communicating with the dreamer alone and is selecting symbols for its purpose that have meaning to the dreamer and to nobody else. Thus, the interpretation of dreams, whether by the analyst or by the dreamer himself, is for the Jungian psychologist an entirely personal and individual business, and sometimes an experimental and very lengthy one as well, that can by no means be undertaken by rule of thumb. The converse of this is that the communications of the unconscious are of the highest importance to the dreamer, naturally so, since the unconscious is at least half of his total being, and frequently offer him advice or guidance that could be obtained from no other source. And thus, when I described Jung's dream about addressing the multitude, I was not describing a piece of magic or suggesting that Jung dabbled in fortune-telling. I was recounting, in the simple terms of daily experience, how Jung was advised by his own unconscious to reconsider an inadequate judgment he had made with the conscious part of his mind. Now it follows from this that the dreaming of dreams is not a matter that the well-adjusted Jungian can regard as simply a matter of chance. On the contrary, the ability to establish communication with the unconscious is a part of the whole man, and Jungians teach themselves, I can think of no better term, to be receptive to dreams. When therefore Jung himself was faced with the critical decision whether or not to write this book, he was able to draw on the resources of both his conscious and his unconscious in making up his mind. And all through this book you will find the dream treated as a direct, personal, and meaningful communication to the dreamer, a communication that uses the symbols common to all mankind, but that uses them on every occasion in an entirely individual way that can be interpreted only by an entirely individual key. The second point I wish to make is about a particular characteristic of argumentative method that is common to all the writers of this book, perhaps of all Jungians. Those who have limited themselves to living entirely in the world of the conscious and who reject communication with the unconscious bind themselves by the laws of conscious, formal life, with the infallible but often meaningless logic of the algebraic equation. They argue from assumed premises to incontestably deduced conclusions. Jung and his colleagues seem to me, whether they know it or not, to reject the limitations of this method of argument. It is not that they ignore logic, but they appear all the time to be arguing to the unconscious as well as to the conscious. Their dialectical method is itself symbolic and often devious. They convince not by means of the narrowly focused spotlight of the syllogism, but by skirting, by repetition, by presenting a recurring view of the same subject, seen each time from a slightly different angle, until suddenly the reader who has never been aware of a single conclusive moment of proof finds that he has unknowingly embraced and taken into himself some wider truth. Jung's arguments spiral upward over his subject, like a bird circling a tree. At first, near the ground, it sees only a confusion of leaves and branches. Gradually, as it circles higher and higher, the recurring aspects of the tree form a wholeness and relate to their surroundings. Some readers may find this spiraling method of argument obscure or even confusing for a few pages, but not, I think, for long. It is characteristic of Jung's method, and very soon the reader will find it carrying him with it on a persuasive and profoundly absorbing journey. The different sections of this book speak for themselves and require little introduction from me. Jung's own chapter introduces the reader to the unconscious, to the archetypes and symbols that form its language, and to the dreams by which it communicates. Dr. Henderson in the following chapter illustrates the appearance of several archetypes, patterns, in ancient mythology, folk legend, and primitive ritual. Dr. von Franz, in the chapter entitled The Process of Individuation, describes the process by which the conscious and the unconscious within an individual learn to know, respect, and accommodate one another. In a certain sense, This chapter contains not only the crux of the whole book, but perhaps the essence of Jung's philosophy of life. Man becomes whole, integrated, calm, fertile, and happy when, and only when, the process of individuation is complete, when the conscious and the unconscious have learned to live at peace and to complement one another. Mrs. Yaffe, like Dr. Henderson, is concerned with demonstrating, in the familiar fabric of the conscious, man's recurring interest, an almost obsession with, the symbols of the unconscious. They have for him a profoundly significant, almost a nourishing and sustaining inner attraction, whether they occur in the myths and fairy tales that Dr. Henderson analyzes or in the visual arts, which, as Miss Yaffe shows, satisfy and delight us by a constant appeal to the unconscious. Finally, I must say a brief word about Dr. Jacobi's chapter, which is somewhat separate from the rest of the book. It is, in fact, an abbreviated case history of one interesting and successful analysis. The value of such a chapter in a book like this is obvious, but 2 words of warning are nevertheless necessary. First, as Dr. von Franz points out, there is no such thing as a typical Jungian analysis. There can't be, because every dream is a private and individual communication, and no 2 dreams use the symbols of the unconscious in the same way. So every Jungian analysis is unique, and it is misleading to consider this one, taken from Dr. Jacobi's files, or any other one there has ever been, as representative or typical. All one can say of the case of Henry and his sometimes lurid dreams is that they form one true example of the way in which the Jungian method may be applied to a particular case. Secondly, the full history of even a comparatively uncomplicated case would take a whole book to recount. Inevitably, the story of Henry's analysis suffers a little in compression. The references, for instance, to the I Ching, or Book of Changes, have been somewhat obscured and lent an unnatural and to me unsatisfactory flavor of the occult by being presented out of their full context. Nevertheless, we concluded, and I am sure the reader will agree, that, with the warnings duly given, the clarity, to say nothing of the human interest, of Henry's analysis greatly enriches this book. I began by describing how Jung came to write Man and His Symbols. I end by reminding the reader of what a remarkable, perhaps unique publication this is. Carl Gustav Jung was one of the great doctors of all time and one of the great thinkers of this century. His object always was to help men and women to know themselves, so that by self-knowledge and thoughtful self-use they could lead full, rich, and happy lives. At the very end of his own life, which was as full, rich, and happy as any I have ever encountered, he decided to use his strength that was left to him to address his message to a wider public than he had ever tried to reach before. He completed his task and his life in the same month. This book is his legacy to the broad reading public. This is the introduction to Man and His Symbols by Carl Gustav Jung. I'm going to take a moment to breathe, drink some water. I think I am ready to continue. Let's go. Now we are getting into the good stuff. This is where Carl Jung begins to write. So we finished the introduction by John Freeman, and this is now Jung's book. Let's see if you can get maybe a little bit of the illustration here. Approaching the unconscious. Carl G. Jung. The importance of dreams. Man uses the spoken or written word to express the meaning of what he wants to convey. His language is full of symbols, but he also often employs signs or images that are not strictly descriptive. Some are mere abbreviations or strings of initials, such as UN, UNICEF, or UNESCO. Others are familiar trademarks, the names of patent medicines, badges, or insignia. Although these are meaningless in themselves, they have acquired a recognizable meaning through common usage or deliberate intent. Such things are not symbols, they are signs. They do no more than denote the objects to which they are attached. What we call a symbol is a term, a name, or even a picture that may be familiar in daily life, yet that possesses specific connotations in addition to its conventional and obvious meaning. It implies something vague, unknown, or hidden from us. Many Cretan monuments, for instance, are marked with the design of the double adze. This is an object that we know, but we do not know its symbolic implications. For another example, take the case of the Indian who, after a visit to England, told his friends at home that the English worship animals because he found eagles, lions, and oxen in old churches. He was not aware, nor are many Christians, that these animals are symbols of the evangelists and are derived from the vision of Ezekiel, and that this in turn has an analogy to the Egyptian sun god Horus and his 4 sons. There are, moreover, such objects as the wheel and the cross that are known all over the world, yet that have a symbolic significance under certain conditions. Precisely what they symbolize is still a matter for controversial speculation. Thus, a word or an image is symbolic when it implies something more than its obvious and immediate meaning. It has a wider unconscious aspect that is never precisely defined or fully explained. Nor can one hope to define or explain it. As the mind explores the symbol, it is led to ideas that lie beyond the grasp of reason. The wheel may lead our thoughts toward the concept of a divine sun, but at this point, reason must admit its incompetence. Man is unable to define a divine being. When, with all our intellectual limitations, we call something divine, we have merely given it a name, which may be based on a creed, but never on factual evidence. Because there are innumerable things beyond the range of human understanding, we constantly use symbolic terms to represent concepts that we cannot define or fully comprehend. This is one reason why all religions employ symbolic language or images. But this conscious use of symbols is only one aspect of a psychological fact of great importance. Man also produces symbols unconsciously and spontaneously, in the form of dreams. It is not easy to grasp this point, but the point must be grasped if we are to know more about the ways in which the human mind works. Man, as we realize, if we reflect for a moment, never perceives anything fully or comprehends anything completely. He can see, hear, touch, and taste, but how far he sees, how well he hears, what his touch tells him, and what he tastes depends upon the number and quality of his senses. These limit his perception of the world around him. By using scientific instruments, he can partly compensate for the deficiencies of his senses. For example, he can extend the range of his vision by binoculars, or of his hearing by electrical amplification. Hello, Daniel. Welcome to the stream. But the most elaborate apparatus cannot do more than bring distant or small objects within range of his eyes, or make faint sounds more audible. No matter what instrument he uses, at some point he reaches the edge of certainty beyond which conscious knowledge cannot pass. There are, moreover, unconscious aspects of our perception of reality. The first is the fact that even when our senses react to real phenomena, sights and sounds, they are somehow translated from the realm of reality into that of the mind. Within the mind, they become psychic events, whose ultimate nature is unknowable, for the psyche cannot know its own psychical substance. Thus, every experience contains an indefinite number of unknown factors, not to speak of the fact that every concrete object is always unknown in certain respects because we cannot know the ultimate nature of matter itself. Then there are certain events of which we have not consciously taken note. They have remained, so to speak, below the threshold of consciousness. They have happened, but they have been absorbed subliminally, without our conscious knowledge. We can become aware of such happenings only in a moment of intuition or by a process of profound thought that leads to a later realization that they must have happened. And though we may have originally ignored their emotional and vital importance, it later wells up from the unconscious as a sort of afterthought. It may appear, for instance, in the form of a dream. As a general rule, the unconscious aspect of any event is revealed to us in dreams, where it appears not as a rational thought but as a symbolic image. As a matter of history, it was the study of dreams that first enabled psychologists to investigate the unconscious aspect of conscious psychic events. It is on such evidence that psychologists assume the existence of an unconscious psyche, though many scientists and philosophers deny its existence. They argue naively that such an assumption implies the existence of two subjects, or, to put it in a common phrase, two personalities within the same individual. But this is exactly what it does imply, quite correctly, and it is one of the curses of modern man that many people suffer from. This divided personality. It is by no means a pathological symptom. It is a normal fact that can be observed at any time and everywhere. It is not merely the neurotic, whose right hand does not know what the left hand is doing. This predicament is a symptom of a general unconsciousness that is the undeniable common inheritance of all mankind. Man has developed consciousness slowly and laboriously, in a process that took untold ages to reach the civilized state, which is arbitrarily dated from the invention of script in about 4000 BC. And this evolution is far from complete, for large areas of the human mind are still shrouded in darkness. What we call the psyche is by no means identical with our consciousness and its contents. Whoever denies the existence of the unconscious is in fact assuming that our present knowledge of the psyche is total. And this belief is clearly just as false as the assumption that we know all there is to be known about the natural universe. Our psyche is part of nature, and its enigma is as limitless. Thus we cannot define either the psyche or nature. We can merely state what we believe them to be and describe, as best we can, how they function. Quite apart, therefore, from the evidence that medical research has accumulated, there are strong grounds of logic for rejecting statements like, "there is no unconscious." Those who say such things merely express an age-old misoneism, a fear of the new and the unknown. There are historical reasons for this resistance to the idea of an unknown part of the human psyche. Consciousness is a very recent acquisition of nature, and it is still in an experimental state. It is frail, menaced by specific dangers, and easily injured. As anthropologists have noticed, one of the most common mental derangements that occur among primitive people is what they call the loss of a soul, which means, as the name indicates, a noticeable disruption, or more technically, a dissociation of consciousness. Among such people, whose consciousness is at a different level of development from ours, the soul, or psyche, is not felt to be a unit. Many primitives assume that a man has a bush soul, as well as his own, and that this bush soul is incarnate in a wild animal or a tree, with which the human individual has some kind of psychic identity. This is what the distinguished French ethnologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl called a mystical participation. He later retracted this term under pressure of adverse criticism, but I believe that his critics were wrong. It is a well-known psychological fact that an individual may have such an unconscious identity with some other person or object. This identity takes a variety of forms among primitives. If the bush soul is that of an animal, the animal is considered as some sort of brother to the man. A man whose brother is a crocodile, for instance, is supposed to be safe when swimming in a crocodile-infested river. If the bush soul is a tree, the tree is presumed to have something like parental authority over the individual concerned. In both cases, an injury to the bush soul is interpreted as an injury to the man. In some tribes, it is assumed that a man has a number of souls. This belief expresses the feeling of some primitive individuals that they each consist of several linked but distinct units. This means that the individual psyche is far from being safely synthesized. On the contrary, it threatens to fragment only too easily under the onslaught of unchecked emotions. While this situation is familiar to us, from the studies of anthropologists, it is not so irrelevant to our own advanced civilization as it might seem. We too can become dissociated and lose our identity. We can be possessed and altered by moods, or become unreasonable and unable to recall important facts about ourselves or others, so that people ask, "What the devil has gotten into you?" We talk about being able to control ourselves, but self-control is a rare and remarkable virtue. We may think we have ourselves under control, yet a friend can easily tell us things about ourselves of which we have no knowledge. Beyond doubt, even in what we call a high level of civilization, human consciousness has not yet achieved a reasonable degree of continuity. It is still vulnerable and liable to fragmentation. This capacity to isolate part of one's mind, indeed, is a valuable characteristic. It enables us to concentrate upon one thing at a time, excluding everything else that may claim our attention. But there is a world of difference between a conscious decision to split off and temporarily suppress a part of one's psyche, and a condition in which this happens spontaneously, without one's knowledge or consent, or even against one's intention. The former is a civilized achievement, the latter a primitive loss of a soul, or even the pathological cause of a neurosis. Thus, even in our day, the unity of consciousness is still a doubtful affair. It can too easily be disrupted. An ability to control one's emotions that may be very desirable from one point of view would be a questionable accomplishment from another, for it would deprive social intercourse of variety, color, and warmth. It is against this background that we must review the importance of dreams. Those flimsy, evasive, unreliable, vague, and uncertain fantasies. To explain my point of view, I would like to describe how it developed over a period of years, and how I was led to conclude that dreams are the most frequent and universally accessible source for the investigation of man's symbolizing faculty. Sigmund Freud was the pioneer who first tried to explore empirically the unconscious background of consciousness. He worked on the general assumption that dreams are not a matter of chance, but are associated with conscious thoughts and problems. This assumption was not in the least arbitrary. It was based upon the conclusion of eminent neurologists, for instance, Pierre Janet, that neurotic symptoms are related to some conscious experience. They even appear to be split-off areas of the conscious mind, which at another time and under different circumstances can be conscious. Before the beginning of the century, Freud and Joseph Breuer had recognized that neurotic symptoms, hysteria, certain types of pain, and abnormal behavior are in fact symbolically meaningful. They are one way in which the unconscious mind expresses itself, just as it may in dreams, and they are equally symbolic. A patient, for instance, who is confronted with an intolerable situation may develop a spasm whenever he tries to swallow. He can't swallow it. Under similar conditions of psychological stress, another patient has an attack of asthma. He can't breathe the atmosphere at home. A third suffers from a peculiar paralysis of the legs. He can't walk. He can't go on anymore. A fourth who vomits when he eats cannot digest some unpleasant fact. I could cite many examples of this kind, but such physical reactions are only one form in which the problems that trouble us unconsciously may express themselves. They more often find expression in our dreams. Any psychologist who has listened to numbers of people describing their dreams knows that dream symbols have much greater variety than the physical symptoms of neurosis. They often consist of elaborate and picturesque fantasies. But if the analyst who is confronted by this dream material uses Freud's original technique of free association, he finds that dreams can eventually be reduced to certain basic patterns. This technique played an important part in the development of psychoanalysis, for it enabled Freud to use dreams as the starting point from which the unconscious problem of the patient might be explored. Freud made the simple but penetrating observation that if a dreamer is encouraged to go on talking about his dream, images and the thoughts that these prompt in his mind, he will give himself away and reveal the unconscious background of his ailments, in both what he says and what he deliberately omits saying. His ideas may seem irrational and irrelevant, but after a time it becomes relatively easy to see what it is that he is trying to avoid, what unpleasant thought or experience he is suppressing. No matter how he tries to camouflage it, everything he says points to the core of his predicament. A doctor sees so many things from the seamy side of life that he is seldom far away from the truth as he interprets the hints that his patient produces as signs of an uneasy conscience. What he eventually discovers, unfortunately, confirms his expectations. Thus far, nobody can say anything against Freud's theory of repression and wish fulfillment as apparent causes of dream symbolism. Freud attached particular importance to dreams as the point of departure for a process of free association. But after a time, I began to feel that this was a misleading and inadequate use of the rich fantasies that the unconscious produces in sleep. My doubts really began when a colleague told me of an experience he had during the course of a long train journey in Russia. Though he did not know of the language and could not even decipher the Cyrillic script, he found himself musing over the strange letters in which the railway notices were written, and he fell into a reverie in which he imagined all sorts of meanings for them. One idea led to another, and in his relaxed mood he found that this free association had stirred up many old memories. Among them, he was annoyed to find some long-buried disagreeable topics, things he had wished to forget and had forgotten consciously. He had, in fact, arrived at what psychologists would call his complexes. That is, repressed emotional themes that can cause constant psychological disturbances or even, in many cases, the symptoms of a neurosis. This episode opened my eyes to the fact that it was not necessary to use a dream as the point of departure for the process of free association. If one wished to discover the complexes of a patient, it showed me that one can reach the center directly from any point of the compass. One could begin from Cyrillic letters, from meditations upon a crystal ball, a prayer wheel, or a modern painting, or even from casual conversation about some trivial event. The dream was no more and no less useful in this respect than any other possible starting point. Nevertheless, dreams have a particular significance, even though they often arise from an emotional upset in which the habitual complexes are also involved. The habitual complexes are the tender spots of the psyche, which react most quickly to an external stimulus or disturbance. That is why free association can lead from any dream to the critical secret thoughts. At this point, however, it occurred to me that if I was right so far, it might reasonably follow that dreams have some special and more significant function of their own. Very often, dreams have a definite, evidently purposeful structure, indicating an underlying idea or intention, though as a rule, the latter is not immediately comprehensible. I therefore began to consider whether one should pay more attention to the actual form and content of a dream rather than allowing free association to lead one off through a train of ideas to complexes that could as easily be reached by other means. This new thought was a turning point in the development of my psychology. It meant that I gradually gave up following associations that led far away from the text of a dream. I chose to concentrate rather on the associations to the dream itself, believing that the latter expressed something specific that the unconscious was trying to say. The change in my attitude towards dreams involved a change of method. The new technique was one that could take account of all the various wider aspects of a dream. A story told by the conscious mind has a beginning, a development, and an end. But the same time is not true. But the same is not true of a dream. Its dimensions in time and space are quite different. To understand it, you must examine it from every aspect, just as you may take an unknown object in your hands and turn it over until you are familiar with every detail of its shape. Perhaps I have now said enough to show how I came increasingly to disagree with free association as Freud first employed it. I wanted to keep as close as possible to the dream itself and to exclude all the irrelevant ideas and associations that it might evoke. True, these could lead one toward the complexes of a patient, but I had a far reaching purpose in mind than the discovery of complexes that cause neurotic disturbances. There are many other means by which these can be identified. The psychologist, for instance, can get all the hints he needs by using word association tests, by asking the patient what he associates to a given set of words, and by studying his responses. But to know and understand the psychic life process of an individual's whole personality, it is important to realize that his dreams and their symbolic images have a much more important role to play. I think that I'm going to leave it off here today. If anyone has anything to say about the reading so far, feel free to drop it in chat. I think it's been really interesting. I think this is a most fascinating text, and makes me want to pay more attention to the unconscious parts of my mind and really realize you always know some part of your brain is subverting some other part of your brain. It happens so often. There's always some kind of like inner conflict in between us. But it's always nice to be reminded of the depths and the values of the unconscious. For now, I think I'm just going to take a rest. Thank you very much for watching, and have a wonderful day.